In today's video, I will take a somewhat unusual approach by temporarily setting aside philosophers to discuss the myth of Adam and Eve and the original sin. I am aware that using the term myth might offend the sensitivities of some people, particularly those who consider the story of Adam and Eve not as a myth, but as reality. Thus, I would like to clarify that my analysis does not focus on the actual existence of Adam and Eve, but rather concentrates on this episode from a purely philosophical perspective. I aim to understand the possible lessons from this story, what it can teach us in terms of knowledge, and how this myth can help us better understand our world and human condition. To recap, the myth of Adam and Eve originates from Genesis in the Old Testament and follows the narrative of the universe's creation. According to the Bible, God created the universe, and on the sixth day he formed man, Adam, from the dust of the earth or clay. Adam, whose name is derived from the Hebrew word Adama, meaning earth, is literally he who comes from the clay. It is said that God formed man from the dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, thus making him a living being. Etymologically, it is interesting to note that Adam is the masculine form of Adama, reinforcing the idea that Adam is somewhat the husband of the earth. This perspective is fascinating because it allows us to reflect on the historical role of man on earth, a role often interpreted as assertive and symbolically associated with the masculine polarity, while the earth itself is seen as nurturing, naturally producing life. We often use the expression Mother Nature to symbolize the abundance of the earth, an abundance that man exploits to his advantage. Thus, Adam represents the man of the earth, the male principle, while the earth itself embodies the female principle, nature. Adam, derived from humus, illustrates the connection between humus and human, emphasizing that Adam is not just a man in the individual sense, but represents man with a capital M. This idea, previously discussed by Plato, transcends sexual divisions and represents the human being as a whole, encompassing both men and women. Regarding Eve, Genesis informs us that she was created from Adam's rib, which can also be interpreted as side, reflecting the close relationship between the words rib and side. Thus, Eve symbolizes the feminine side of Adam, and her name means life. Adam and Eve are also called Ish and Isha in Hebrew, where Ish represents the masculine and Isha the feminine, highlighting that Adam, the model of humanity, incorporates both masculine and feminine aspects. Initially, Adam was thus an androgynous entity, a totality containing both polarities. This notion reflects the idea that Adam was created in the image of God, who as a perfect being encompasses both masculine and feminine aspects. This conception of Adam as a generic being, transcending sexual division, places him in the image of God. This idea also resonates with the myth of the androgynes recounted by Plato in the Symposium, where it is explained that at the beginning of humanity, the androgynes were creatures both male and female, total and perfect beings. It is precisely because they were perfect creatures endowed with exceptional power that they sought to measure themselves against the gods. Zeus, to prevent them, attempted to weaken them by splitting them in two, which led to the sexual division between men and women. Let's return to the story of the original sin, as it is told to us. Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden, a place of abundance where nothing was lacking. They did not need to work to live, enjoying complete carefreeness about the future, in a garden where time seemed suspended and without constraints. However, one prohibition was imposed on them. They were not to taste the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the infamous forbidden fruit. The Eternal One had clearly expressed this prohibition to them, telling them they could eat the fruits from all trees except for that one. The temptation occurred when Eve met the serpent, who assured her that eating the fruit would not kill them, but would open their eyes, making them equal to the gods. Intrigued and persuaded by the serpent, Eve tasted the fruit and then gave it to Adam, who also ate it. At that moment, Adam realized he was naked, felt ashamed, and hid himself. The Eternal One, realizing they had eaten the fruit because their shame betrayed a newfound awareness of their vulnerability, did not delay in punishing them. The expulsion from the Garden of Eden was immediate, and the Eternal One pronounced this famous sentence, "From now on, you will earn your bread by the sweat of your brow." Eve, you will give birth in pain, and as for the serpents, cursed be they are condemned to crawl. This means that their form was not as we know it before this curse. It is said to the serpents, you will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life. The function inflicted on the serpents is to be at the lowest level of existence, becoming one of the lowest beings on the scale of being, in constant contact with the earth, that is, with matter, often associated with a pejorative connotation in Christian religion. How then to interpret what happens to Adam and Eve? The initial problem is that God warned them that if they tasted the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they would die. However, they do not die. They are expelled from the Garden of Eden and thus condemned to suffer, not to death. Eve is condemned to give birth in pain. When we talk about childbirth, often described as the labor of a woman, we use the word labor from the Latin tripalium, which denotes an instrument of torture, highlighting the inherent suffering in childbirth. This physical suffering is inseparable from the world of materiality and constitutes the condition for the reproduction of the vital cycle on earth. As for man, he must work and earn his bread by the sweat of his brow. Here the work is not for reproduction but for production. It is the labor of the land, a task that is also accomplished in suffering. To work by the sweat of one's brow indicates this suffering associated with the production and extraction of the earth's resources. Vital resources play a key role in the perpetuation of the vital cycle. Why then did the Eternal One tell Adam and Eve that they would die if they tasted the fruit? In reality, he did not specify that they would die immediately. What we can deduce is that they entered a material dimension where death becomes inevitable. This dimension is that of matter and time, closely linked since time only makes sense with the emergence of matter. Time appeared at the moment of the Big Bang, that is, when matter burst into the universe. Thus, Adam and Eve do not die immediately. They are rather expelled from the Garden of Eden, a place out of time, and plunged into a material world where they will experience death. Their expulsion compels them to work to survive, whether through tilling the soil to obtain food resources or through the effort of childbirth, which allows humanity to perpetuate itself through generations. They are therefore condemned to live according to the laws of matter, including the principles of generation and reproduction. Adam and Eve, propelled into the material world, are also propelled into time. If time did not exist, there would be neither birth nor death. They would remain in an eternal state, similar to that of God. However, the Eternal One, being outside of time, neither is born nor dies. He transcends becoming. It is the existence of matter that gives birth to time, because everything that exists in time must necessarily evolve and change. There is, therefore, a beginning and an end, which means that it is time that will eventually kill Adam and Eve. It is also time that will make them suffer, as surviving in the material world demands labor and suffering. Here, one can refer to the poem by Charles Baudelaire titled The Enemy, in which it is clearly expressed that the enemy is time itself. Baudelaire describes how time makes us suffer by limiting our existence between two inevitable temporal boundaries. He also emphasizes that time engenders suffering through the constant obsession with death and the weight of the past marked by nostalgia and regret. This material existence necessarily becomes a source of anxiety as soon as it is accompanied by the awareness of our mortality. Death is inevitably the consequence of time, highlighting the distinction made by Plato between existence, linked to the sensible and material world, and life, a general process that transcends matter and persists through individuals. What then are Adam and Eve condemned to? They are condemned to fall into matter, to enter the sensible world of Plato. This idea is reinforced when God gives them garments of skin, indicating that previously they were not clothed, did not have material bodies. Thus, they were in a non-material world. Expelled from the Garden of Eden, they leave a place outside of time, a place close to the Creator, where suffering and death are absent, to fall into a dimension where they experience degradation and suffering. This image of the fall thus symbolizes a degradation of the being. The generic offer depicts an original state of plenitude and immediate relationships with the being of pure immanence, from which Eve and Adam will fall into a lower dimension marked by time, matter, and suffering. Observe what happens when Adam tastes the fruit. He discovers he is naked and feels shame. What does this mean? Shame marks the entry into the world of representation, into a universe where self-image takes on crucial importance. Being ashamed of one's nudity implies adopting the external gaze, that of someone who sees us naked. One does not feel shame about being naked when alone or when no one is watching. Shame occurs when one becomes aware that others can see us, and we do not wish it. This concern about the gaze of others, which conditions our feeling of shame, suggests that there can be no shame without a representation of oneself through this gaze. This leads to a dissociation of oneself from oneself, signifying an exit from immanence and a process of distancing and internal division. It is the world of self-consciousness, the moment when one begins to apprehend oneself from the viewpoint of others, which did not exist before Adam tasted the fruit. He lived in an immediate relationship to being, but as soon as he awakens to knowledge, he becomes aware of this division and operates a separation from himself, which is both an act of consciousness and also of representation and guilt. Genesis reveals to us that after tasting the fruit, they became aware of their nakedness. The Eternal One then asks Adam, "Who told you that you were naked?" This emphasizes that before this moment, there was no self-awareness or guilt. Adam is not completely ignorant. He is aware of his nakedness. This suggests that previously, he may have been blind to knowledge, especially that of good and evil. Although he saw that he was naked, he was unaware until then of the moral and mental significance of this nakedness. They did not know the distinction between flesh and spirit, which is understandable considering that the Garden of Eden was not a world of materiality. Adam and Eve did not live in matter and only became aware of the material dimension after tasting the fruit. This awareness brought about the phenomenon of dissociation and representation. Also, recall what Christ says in the Bible, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." This phrase can be interpreted in connection with the original sin. Being poor in spirit is not about being foolish or silly. I looked up the etymology of the word fool, which comes from without crutches. In this allegory, the crutch represents the knowledge upon which one relies to progress. Thus, culture would be this crutch of being. The fool, in this context, is one who does not have this crutch, perhaps because he does not need knowledge to be in emanating relation with being. The poor in spirit live in an immediate relationship to being, and nudity does not pose a problem for them because there is no shame to be had in a natural situation. For them, nudity is a sort of evidence of being, for one is not born clothed. Being ashamed of one's nudity marks the end of unity with being, indicating a shift towards duality, where image and representation now prevail. This raises a question. Why did Adam and Eve, while living in an immediate and spontaneous relationship with being, feel the need and desire to taste this fruit? If they lacked nothing, where did this desire to look elsewhere come from? Perhaps there was a dissatisfaction within them, a sign that pure immanence no longer sufficed, and they aspired to transcend this obviousness. This desire could be interpreted as a sin of pride, which St. Augustine defines as concupiscence. This need was present in Adam and Eve, even though they were not aware of committing a reprehensible act at that time. For them, curiosity was not malevolent because they were unaware of the very notion of evil, as well as the distinction between good and evil. In the absence of this distinction, where everything resides in immanence and pure evidence, the question of evil does not even arise. This situation presents a clear analogy with the state of nature described by Rousseau, where, according to him, man is neither good nor bad because he does not question it. He spontaneously obeys the laws of nature. It is only when he enters into the civil state, into the social context, that distinctions between good and evil emerge, and with them, the world of representation. As man transitions to the social state, he is no longer alone. He is no longer in the natural and original state of his condition. He enters a world of comparison, competition, representation, where the complexity of human interactions begins. It is at this moment that the distinction between good and evil is born, between what is allowed and what is not, between what one can do and what one must not do. The phrase of Christ, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," underscores this idea, as being poor in spirit means not asking unnecessary questions. Simple here means made up of a single element, in opposition to complicated, which is made up of multiple elements. Adam is poor in spirit when he does not question the meaning of his state and his own lucidity. He is in a direct and immediate relationship with being, poor in spirit when he does not need to consider the gaze of others to know who he is. However, his spirit becomes complex when an internal bifurcation begins, at the moment he starts to concern himself with the image he projects, thus entering the world of the mind. The sin they committed, in reality, was that of having broken this unity, of having ruptured this original fusion, with being in a Garden of Eden devoid of division, duality, plurality, where everything is one and obvious, where the mind is superfluous, except to have been knowingly introduced into the garden. If the serpent symbolizes the mind, representing division, separation, representation, it was placed in the garden so that Adam and Eve could experience division. Their sin, therefore, was to break this unity. Questions do not arise when everything is evident and unified. Questions emerge from the moment there is separation, when there is a distance between the subject and the object. But if there is no object of separation, questions do not arise. There is no subject if there are no objects to think about, thus no thought. We do not ask questions without this. Thought emerges with duality, the self that thinks and the thing that is thought, signifying that duality is in itself a loss since it implies the loss of unity. When one must articulate something and materialize it with words, it means that it is no longer self-evident. It means that we have lost the obviousness and immediacy of what we express. To express something is to bring it out of ourselves, indicating the need to have articulated it, thus operating in internal fragmentation. Duality is a loss, but it is also a gain, perhaps that of intelligence, which allows us to retrospectively grasp what is contained in unity. One can consider an interpretation that is not axiological, which does not rely on a value judgment of this transition from unity to duality. Unity can be seen as a state of idyllic immanence, a golden age. However, from a certain point of view, duality allows a return to unity in order to grasp it, understand it, and reinscribe it in a general schema. Duality is not the opposite of unity. It contains what unity encompasses. When the serpent says, "If you taste the fruit, you will be like gods," it means that the knowledge of the gods is not limited to this immediacy of the relationship to being, but encompasses the mental dimension, the divided form of this unity. The specificity of duality is to break the obviousness, and it is this that generates the realm of the possible. The possible is what can be realized by distinction from what is immediately evident as soon as there is duality. There exists a possibility to deviate from what seemed obvious, normal, or natural, and with that possibility emerges the possibility of evil. In reality, evil is nothing other than the possibility of evil. What makes the difference, what allows the shift from the mere possibility of evil to evil itself, is free will, the choice of each individual to consider this possibility and to materialize it. For example, when the Eternal One tells Adam and Eve that they can eat the fruits of all trees except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he establishes a duality between what is forbidden, the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and what is allowed, everything else. This separation creates an internal division and highlights the forbidden, since it is the forbidden that stands out and attracts, distinguishing itself from the field of all that is permitted. Adam and Eve could only be attracted to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, since this tree was distinct from the others. This tree is like an arrow pointing to what one is not allowed to do, specifically inciting one to do it. It's as if I asked you to try not to think of a white horse. Most of you would think of a white horse the moment I told you not to. When this prohibition stands out in a field of permissions, it is the prohibition that attracts. This raises the question of whether, from a biblical perspective, evil is not simply the possibility itself. This is what St. Peter Damian, a theologian of the Middle Ages, believed, considering that plurality was necessarily diabolical while only unity was divine, an idea that is understandable on a conceptual level. If we say that God is unity, it evokes the unity of the immediate relationship to being, the unity of the condition of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where love, light, and truth are one. In contrast, plurality symbolizes the world of division, the world of what distinguishes and separates, moving us away from the original source. Pierre Damien, for example, went so far as to say that the teaching of conjugation was diabolical because the variety of personal pronouns illustrates a dissociation of being, confirming this fragmentation of divine unity. When we say I think, you think, they think, we operate this division of unity, and it is from there that evil insinuates itself. Note that diabolos, the Greek word for devil, means that which divides or separates. If the serpent in the tree of knowledge represents the devil, then its role is to provoke this separation and division of man from himself and from the purity of his immediate relationship to being. Thus, in playing the devil's advocate, knowledge, as discussed here, as a cessation of pure evidence, can serve both good and evil. Knowledge can lead to both medicine and weapons. What makes the difference between uses of knowledge is, once again, free will. Knowledge is not inherently evil. It can lead to evil in its possible consequences, always returning to the question of possibility, which, in humans, corresponds to free will. However, this free will is not a purely random movement of decision-making. The term free will implies more than that. In the word freedom, we also find arbitration, which represents the ability to judge something after examination and to consider its consequences. These consequences are not independent of our choices. They result from the actions we decide to take. For example, if I decide to insult someone on the street, I must expect that person to react, perhaps even violently. This is part of the foreseeable consequences of my choice and illustrates the principle of responsibility. Being responsible means anticipating that reality will react to our choices, and the consequences of these choices are simply the reactions of the material world to our decisions. Responsibility is thus a human law that accompanies freedom. As soon as I make the choice to act, I commit to assuming the consequences of that act. I necessarily assume them because I am free in my choices. Thus, when Adam and Eve chose to eat the apple, they opted for freedom through their act of transgression. They decided not to obey the prohibition, and by doing so, chose to take responsibility, to answer for their actions, and to experience the laws of causality and responsibility in relation to matter. Recall what Schopenhauer explained. The world of representation is subject to the laws of causality and time. This means that every cause produces an effect. I am therefore free to act as I wish, to be the cause of what I desire, but I do not decide the consequences. They are the necessary and logical extension of my choices. By experiencing freedom, I explore the effects of my actions on the world and accept their consequences as the necessary effect of my freedom. Free will cannot exist without the law of causality. There can be no free will without a criterion to judge our actions, and this criterion is the consequences of these actions on the world. Thus, freedom is inextricably linked to the principle of causality. From a biblical perspective, the mere possibility of evil was already considered evil, since knowing good and evil implies the possibility of choosing evil. The devil is the one who offers this possibility, the tempter. However, to consider that the possibility of evil is already evil is to ignore the principle of free will, which allows us to verify through experience the effects of our actions. Denying this is also to deny the human capacity to learn from mistakes, to improve, and to progress. What I mean is that we cannot condemn freedom on the grounds that it can lead to evil, especially when freedom is tied to responsibility. It is through this responsibility that we can direct our freedom to avoid evil. Unless we accept committing evil with impunity, we must acknowledge that if we do evil, we will suffer the consequences. Thus, the serpent in the story of Adam and Eve, the devil, is the one who divides. He is the adversary, the one who creates obstacles, who intervenes between men and divine light. Satan is the one who creates a shadow between God and man, producing the shadow of God. That is why Satanism is often seen as an inversion of values, where the devil represents the negative aspect of light, the darkness. This parallel can also be drawn with Plato's ideas about the sensible world. In Plato's philosophy, the sensible world is a copy of the intelligible world. It participates in this world while being a degraded and corrupted version. From this perspective, the serpent also symbolizes the one who brings freedom, a freedom that is only gained through suffering, because suffering is the price to pay for freedom through responsibility. The serpent acts as the tempter, the one who awakens curiosity. This curiosity is an attraction to the unknown, to what is external and separate from us, a perpetual movement of going beyond oneself. The serpent awakens this curiosity, but it does not create it. Adam and Eve already possessed this curiosity before meeting the serpent, which suggests that it was placed in the Garden of Eden, knowing that this curiosity would draw them towards it. This curiosity represents an impulse, a dynamic movement that materializes Adam and Eve's entry into history, into temporality. The Garden of Eden, in comparison, can be seen as a static, eternal world without history. The encounter with the serpent propels them into history, into the world of matter, and initiates the dynamic movement of mankind, who, after their fall, seeks to rise up by becoming aware of their freedom and the consequences of their actions. They experience suffering, death, and responsibility. Material existence thus becomes a lesson, not only in the sense of punishment, but also as teaching. The Eternal One gave a lesson to Adam and Eve by plunging them into the world of matter, showing them that if you want to be free, you will understand what freedom costs. You will taste your freedom and appreciate everything it entails, including responsibility and suffering. Work involves learning about existence, as we learn through suffering and labor. We learn by analyzing the consequences of our actions and by seeking to understand the world around us. Thus, the original sin represents the first choice of man, his first act of freedom. Adam and Eve had the choice to obey or to transgress, but obey what? They could not disobey because they did not know what they were obeying. Not being aware of what transgression is means that one is not truly in a state of obedience. In transgressing, Adam and Eve did not truly transgress. They exercised their free will and must assume responsibility for it. They had been warned. They are neither guilty nor innocent. They simply followed that inner movement that pushed them to explore this freedom. I was making a parallel earlier between the Garden of Eden and the state of nature in Rousseau. In both cases, the same mechanisms are at work. From the Garden of Eden to the world of matter in the myth of Adam and Eve, and from the state of nature to the civil state in Rousseau. The expulsion from the Garden of Eden symbolizes the exit from the state of nature, where everything is given to man, to enter the civil state where he must cultivate the land, work, and be concerned with image and representation. In the state of nature, as in the Garden of Eden, men have everything they want. They need nothing. Everything is in abundance, and work is not necessary. Work becomes necessary as a means to recreate the conditions of the state of nature through science, technology, and work itself, meaning that work is the condition of redemption and salvation for man after their sins. In the material world, as in the civil state, work is essential, and it is through this work that we can regain the conditions of the state of nature, an original paradise where everything was in abundance. Thus, whatever the situation, men redeem themselves where they have sinned, by the fall into the state of nature and by their passage into the civil state. Man thus makes his entry into history, where he struggles to survive and for resources according to the principles of scarcity. The struggle becomes the engine of history, and to exit and return to a golden age, it is necessary to go back through work. I have drawn a parallel between the Garden of Eden and the state of nature in Rousseau, but this experience can also be compared to intrauterine existence. Adam is similar to a fetus. He is not aware of his body. He is in unity with his environment, in immediate fusion with his mother, ignorant of the divisions of matter. Yet he will experience a fall, a separation from this maternal unity. As he moves away from this origin, the human being grows, learns, gains experience, and forges his free will. He exercises his freedom wisely by analyzing causes and effects while feeling a nostalgia for the lost paradise. Just as the first cry of a baby at birth is a cry of suffering, the fall into matter is painful, but leads to learning and the acquisition of consciousness. The baby who comes out of the mother's womb suffers, but this suffering saddens no one, because it is recognized that it is through this primal breath that learning begins. Ultimately, the suffering of birth is necessary to evolve, just as the suffering of Adam and Eve was necessary to allow them to develop. Are they guilty of having been corrupted by the serpent? I would say that if they were corrupted, it's because they were corruptible. And if they were corruptible, it's because they were created corruptible. The sin was therefore foreseen. It was necessary. Why was the serpent there? How could it speak to them? Who let it in? When we talk about original sin, it can be understood in a dual sense. Original sin as the sin of origin, thus the first sin in a historical sense, but perhaps also as something deeper, originating, meaning constitutive. Thus, original sin could be seen as the structural sin on which humanity is founded. In this case, sin is not tied to a form of guilt. Sin is the act that precedes learning. Moreover, it is notable that there is no anger in God when he expels Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. There is no emotion. God is not angry. He does not hold a grudge. They are expelled because they had been warned. They would be expelled if they transgressed the prohibition. If you taste the fruit, you will die. It was not a curse, but a warning. By tasting the fruit, they thus opened the door to the experience of matter. The Eternal One implanted desire and curiosity in the hearts of Adam and Eve. He gave them free will. The woman saw that the tree was good for food, pleasing to the eye, and desirable for gaining wisdom. When Adam and Eve eat the fruit, it is said that their eyes were opened. Having eyes means they are there to be used. The fault must be experienced because warning is not enough. One does not understand things with eyes closed. It is not enough to warn to understand. One must live and experience the fault to become aware of it. To understand these phenomena, pride, which is the source of sin, must confront itself and what it generates. If the act of freedom involves pride, then that pride will be confronted with its own consequences. This will allow the individual to learn. This means that if Adam and Eve are guilty of pride, it was a flaw intentionally placed in them to mark them with the seal of perfectibility. They have the ability to improve, to learn, and to evolve because they possess within them what will push them to experience. So, did the serpent ultimately do Adam and Eve a favor? Directly, no, but indirectly, perhaps. It might have been a necessary evil, a suffering for a lesson. We know that the serpent is a symbol of ambivalence. It is both the poison and the remedy. Indeed, the serpent appears on the symbol of the pharmacy. This can remind us of the saying by Paracelsus, "Everything is poison. Nothing is poison. It is the dose that makes the poison." In the same way, we can consider that knowledge can be a poison insofar as it takes us away from our immediate relationship to being, but it can also be a remedy, perhaps what allows us to understand ourselves and return to that original state of fusion and unity. Unity is only understood when it divides. Accessing paradise presupposes having known hell, and perhaps we are in hell. If we are in hell, it is not because we have deserved it or because we are sinners, but because we are made to learn. If we are all guilty, we are guilty of the same thing as Adam and Eve, exercising our free will.